Welcome to this module of Professor Messer's free CompTIA A+ certification training course on installing and configuring storage devices. I'm James Messer, and in this module we're going to look at the requirements from our CompTIA A+ 22702 Section 1.1. This is our practical application exam where we are given a scenario. We need to understand how to install, configure, and maintain personal computer components, and specifically storage devices, optical drives, removable drives, external drives, anything that's related to storage devices. We need to know exactly how to get those things installed. Let's start with how we would plug in a PATA connection. If you've seen our videos from our 701 series exam, then you're probably familiar with this PATA cabling. The cabling looks very similar if it's a 40 wire or an 80 wire cable, and this will depend on the type of PATA connections that you have on your motherboard. As we get to higher speeds, you'll see more 80 wire cables show up. The thing that you have to remember about this is that the master on an 80 wire cable plugs into the end of the cable. If you are not running an 80 wire cable, it's sort of the older and more traditional 40 wire cable. The master drive will plug in the middle of the cable. As long as you keep those two things in mind, you'll be pretty well with how things are plugged in and connected in a PATA connection. Be looking for those particular interfaces on your motherboard. This one even has IDE number 1 written right on the motherboard. There is also some keying that is on these particular interfaces. You'll see there is a slot that's cut out of the connector. That's because on the cable itself there are connectors as well. Let me back up here a little bit. You can see the little notches that are sticking out. So that when you plug this in, you'll know that you're plugging it in the right way. Notice that not all cables have that. So sometimes you can plug it in the wrong way if there's not a notch, or notice that there's actually one of the pins of the cable does not go all the way through. It stops right there. That's because one of the pins that's on the motherboard is missing. So this way, if it's dark or you're not exactly looking at it, or it's somewhere it's very difficult to plug in that cable, you'll still know that if it goes in without any type of problem, that you probably got it in just fine, because there's not only that missing pin, but there's the notch. So you have a couple of ways to be sure, even if you can't exactly see it, you can feel that it's absolutely in the right way. The back of the drives themselves also have some of these capabilities. You can see the notches in here and the pin that's missing. Same scenario. So on both sides, whether you're plugging into the motherboard or plugging into the drive, you still have that functionality available as well. And it's not only storage devices that are hard drives, it's also things like CD-ROMs, for instance, that use an AT packet interfaces to be able to communicate over that IDE or that PATA connection. And again, you've got the notches and the missing pins that are in there. Notice there's also some options on your drives for things like cable select, slave, and master. If your motherboard and the hard drive support something called cable select, you can plug in the cable and the drive and the motherboard will coordinate where it happens to be plugged in, and it will make the determination on whether it is the master or the slave. If you're on an older motherboard, you may not have that functionality. You may have to manually say, this hard drive is the master and my CD-ROM drive is the slave drive on this particular cable that I plugged in for PATA. But most of our newer systems can be cable selected. So you may want to take your jumper, move it over to cable select, plug it in, and the motherboard and the drive will figure it out all on their own. If you're on the back of a hard drive and you'll notice you aren't quite certain where those pins are, look on the front of the drive. You can see here's a good example of this. All of the documentation is right on the front of the drive. We can see that the master, the slave, and the cable select are right on the front. So hopefully you won't have to go digging on the internet or trying to find the documentation sheets for the drives that you're using. All of the documentation should be right on the drive itself so that there's no question of exactly how this should be configured. To help view how you should plug this in, I've taken the motherboard and the drive out of the case so we can really see this here. We're plugging into that IDE1 connection. You'll notice that the pin 1, there'll be a selection on the motherboard that it may show a number 1, or you may be using the pins or the different notches that were built in so that we're plugging this cable in properly. The cable simply plugs into your drive, and if it's the master drive, this is a 40-pin cable or a 40-wire cable. You can see all of the different wires coming through, and that means if it's 40 wire that the master drive plugs in at the middle of the cable. So you may may have this little tail that's off of that, and if nothing else is in this computer from a storage device, that tail just sits there. It's just now not connected to anything. Many people will take and fold that up a bit and make sure it's connected in here so that you don't have a lot of cables that are now in the middle of your system, maybe blocking airflow. It's always good if you're able to collapse these things. You can see on this cable, it's been folded up a bit for that very reason. You don't want to bend it, you just want to carefully fold it over, sort of curve it over. This one may have been folded even a little bit too much. You don't want to do too much of that. There are pins in there, there's copper in there. We want to make sure that we don't break any of those pieces of copper, any of those wires. We want to make sure that we don't crimp any of those wires because we may expand it out later and then create even more problems for ourselves.